Harmless desires can become harmful addictions. It really just became obvious that I needed to talk about this because actually because I was chatting with my boyfriend the other day about this because he's been with me through my darkest hours. So he came to learn about how much I struggled with food. And now he can see it, he can observe it in other people where some people would have no idea, they'd be oblivious to it, right? And it's just true that it is so common that our relationship with external things or certain behaviors can become morphed to the point where it becomes destructive. Hey, Deborah, good to see you. And yet you can really start to notice with a lot of things. There'll be many people that have a completely beneficial or inconsequential relationship with it, whilst at the same time, a lot of people have an unhealthy or harmful relationship with it. And one of the most common examples of that is food. It's something that's in all of our lives. In fact, we can't live without it, right? We are surrounded by it all the time. And for many people, food is just food, right? Their relationship with it causes no challenges for them. But we also know that a lot of people suffer severely because of how they view food. And I really believe, I can see that it is far more common than most people realize, right? And because I've gone through it, come out the other side, of some really disastrous patterns with food, right? I'm very adept at recognizing these destructive patterns in others, just like my boyfriend's starting to notice it in others too. And they're actually very common. Yeah, you can identify with that. Right, yeah, you've become aware that there are events in your past that contribute to it, right, exactly. And I'm going to talk about things like that today. It is huge. It is. And I'm passionate about talking about it because it is so difficult when you're struggling with something that is all around you all the time. Like there's no escape from it, right? And some people just don't realize that certain things can cause a lot of suffering for people. Yeah, it brings you to tears. Well, yeah, I've cried many a time over my relationship with food. So today I'm really going to talk about a subset of addictions. Okay, so these are the less typical, less obvious kind that we actually develop gradually. So not just, for example, turning to drugs as a teenager or an adult because subconsciously we're in so much pain, emotional or physical, and are searching for a way to escape. Today, I actually want to focus on the kind that comes from a learned association rather than being driven by a desire for dissociation, right? So the more insidious kind of addiction that takes something that a lot of people see as normal, right? It's a regular part of everyday life, and turns it into something harmful because of the way we start using it in our lives. Because a lot of our specific desires are developed in childhood, right? Not all of them, obviously. Most people don't try like cocaine at age 3 and learn it feels great, right? See, so that's the distinction here today. I'm going to talk about the desires we feel as adults for things that have always been in our lives from a very early age, that just kind of get out of hand, right, and become detrimental and then prevent us from living our desired life. So does that distinction make sense? Yeah. So to start with, and actually I want to add in here, this may contribute to some of your patterns or addictions. Equally, there may be other contributors. It's not always just, oh, my addiction just came from this one thing. Often it can be very complex, but I want to go into this particular subset and way that some can appear. And to start with, I do want to just give you my definition of harmless versus harmful, right? So something's harmless when it doesn't stop you from living the life you want to live. Okay, it may create some limitation, but it's not preventing you from living the life you choose. Okay, and some addictions actually fall under that category, right? Harmless, limiting, but harmless. It becomes harmful when it starts getting in the way of you creating your desired life. So actually keeping you away from the life you want to live. That's when it's harmful. And that's, of course, when it becomes painful. when our desires don't align to our end results. So we experience inner conflict, right? And the inner battle begins. And then at any given moment, any moment in time, we're actually resisting at least one of our desires. We're either suppressing the desires that don't align to the life we want because we're trying to go for that life, or we're giving in to those undesirable desires and therefore sabotaging, resisting our true end results. And when we're resisting our own desires, we're resisting aspects of our own consciousness. So it takes us out of the experience of wholeness. We start to feel split, conflicted, divided, which of course creates a lot of suffering. And most commonly, that creates a sensation or a perception of not being in control. And lack of control is expressed through what we call frustration. Okay, it's a communication of, I don't feel like I'm in control and I don't like it. That's what frustration is at its core, with the underlying assumption, when I'm not in control, I can't get what I want. And when we're frustrated and the person that we're frustrated with is us, it's easy to direct judgment, criticism, and hostility onto ourselves, which creates even more pain. And it's just not the state of love, ease, and flow that we are looking for, right? Who else here is choosing to create a life experience of love, ease, and flow? Yeah. And who can see that it can feel very difficult to love yourself when you are blaming you for your discomfort and actually pain? It's more challenging to love someone that is causing you pain and harm. Not impossible, more challenging. And it's even more difficult when it's yourself, because we often do forget to have compassion for ourselves. Yeah. Hey, Rachel. Hey, Sarah. So happy you're here. So we want to leave behind, simply leave behind any structures that are creating that experience of life that feels hard, painful, conflicted, and trapped in harmful addiction cycles. So let's do a little bit of an overview, some ways, or what we can get addicted to. So we can get addicted to things that we believe allow us to avoid or escape undesired feelings. So using something or some behavior to escape a negative experience. Like, for example, this is the only thing that numbs the pain, right? I see that a lot in people with OCD, as well as alcoholics, drug addicts, and so on. We can also get addicted to things that actually feel horrible, like punishment, right? Which is I must pay penance or repent or suffer, or I must redeem myself or else, right? I have to do this or else I can't escape the guilt or fear or feeling I'm a bad person or whatever it is. So it stems from a belief that it's the only way to avoid an unwanted consequence, right? But the actual thing itself is horrible, right? You are punishing yourself. It's an act of following the rules because it feels like your only choice, right? To break the rule would be too much of a risk of creating some circumstances that you can't allow. Equally, things that we originally experienced as purely positive can become obsessive, compulsive, addictive. And here's the point I want to make. They can start off harmless and later turn into harmful obsession and then addiction. Either because it was right from the beginning the only way you ever accessed certain states. So a common example of that, I would say, would be drugs or plant medicine, right? They can have very unique effects that can be very desirable. And whether or not there are alternative ways to reach similar states, like with breath work or just accessing certain fields of information, that doesn't really matter if the person doesn't know that or hasn't experienced that. So to someone, it may seem like the only option if they want to repeat that kind of experience, like a peak experience that they simply enjoy. Or this transition from harmless to harmful can take place when the association between that thing that you're either using or doing and the desired feeling is so strong that it becomes just the easiest way to access that emotional state, right? So it's the go-to, okay? You may even decide it's the only really effective and reliable way. So you don't even look for other ways. There's no point. And you start going back to it more and more. Maybe you start relying on that emotional state itself. So actually, I need to feel this way in order to have a good day or do well in my presentation or make a good impression, whatever it is. And so use of that thing that you know easily creates that emotional state that you're starting to depend on can become obsessive. And then over time, relying only on that one way to access the feeling, the mind can begin to believe there is no other way you can access it. Maybe nothing else is effective or strong enough, or nothing else is available to you. And it becomes an addiction. So let's dive into some examples. And as we go through this, I want you to think, if there's anything that you are turning to a bit obsessively that's getting in the way of a life you love. Maybe it doesn't even have to feel obsessive, but something that you tend to desire that really takes you out of choice and takes you away from that life you are choosing to create. So, as you may have guessed, I do want to talk about ways that we can learn an addiction to food. And one basic way is a lot of us learn in childhood that it's a way to comfort or cope with pain or stress. Like, when a parent gives a child a lolly when they're getting an injection, right? Parents do this kind of thing all the time. But it seems completely harmless and inconsequential, but it can show up then in adults as compulsively eating when we're stressed or under pressure. But more detailed example would be perhaps, maybe as a child, you experience every Sunday I get to bake with my granddad, right? And it can start off as, I love this. I love getting to do this. And the mind always creates meaning from events. So maybe it creates the meaning, baking and eating cakes means time feeling special and loved with granddad. Yes, Dixie. Yeah, especially if it's the only time you're allowed, the thing is to make up for something bad. Right, yeah. Yeah. So back to this example, right? So the mind can create a meaning. Okay, so when I'm eating cakes, doing all these things with cakes with my granddad, it means I get to feel special and loved, right? So you form a positive association with the cupcakes, right? Or whatever it is. So they're even more desirable to you. So, if you're offered one, it feels good and you enjoy it, right? Still harmless at this point. And then maybe over the years, you have other experiences. Okay, and the mind has already been preset at this point to link cakes with feeling special and loved. And when you look for something, you find it. So you find more evidence of that meaning because you're looking for it. And so you reinforce and add to it. So then at your birthdays, maybe later at graduation, or just whenever you're given cake of some sort, not only do you feel the pleasure of eating it, right? Because, sugar, fat, etc., the body is by default wired to see that as a pretty good thing for survival. So a lot of people like cake. But because of the meaning you've already assigned to it, you also feel a boost of, oh, I'm loved, I'm special. And maybe also now I'm celebrated on top of that, right? See that? So you're getting more pleasure out of the cake than someone who's never given it much meaning. So it becomes more significant to you. And when you make something significant, your mind looks for more of it. Your brain becomes wired to notice it because of its significance, right? So you might start noticing cake shops or slices of cake in the coffee shop way more than your partner that you're walking with, for example, because your mind's given it weight, significance, so it stands out. And depending on how much significance and power your identity gives it, that awareness can move into being obsessive. And remember, every time you eat one or some, your mind remembers the meaning. And so again, you feel that cocktail of feelings, which reinforces that original meaning. Cupcakes equals feeling loved and all these other nice things. And we know what happens when you repeatedly couple a stimulus with a feeling or a state of being. Once you've linked them enough times, it can create an anchor, creates a neurological link up. And that emotional experience becomes like a reflex whenever you're presented with that stimulus. So it becomes automatic. A cake triggers the positive emotional response within you, maybe even before you've eaten it. So what started as a harmless, oh, I really enjoy baking with my granddad. It's how we bond. It's how he shows me love. That's when I spend time with him, right? Just me and him. And yeah, it's nice to have cake on special occasions. That can turn into a significant, to the point of being obsessive, association, which can start to interfere with the choices you want to make in life. Because compared to someone who sees cake on the table and thinks, yeah, looks good, but I'm not really that hungry right now, You might notice it and feel a whole cocktail of feelings and have all sorts of thoughts run through your mind because your brain and body is now wired to expect that feeling that you enjoy when it sees cake. It's an anchor. So it bypasses your cognitive consideration. Do I really want it? Skip the choice part, and instead it can compel you to eat it, right? The cake is significant. My mind knows it makes me feel loved, significant, special. My body is now getting used to that hit of chemicals, a desired emotional state. So now I see it's available. It started a chain reaction where my mind and body expects it, wants it. So I want it now. Oh, load the chat. Yeah, for you making pasta with Nonna. Yeah, so many memories tied to the pasta, exactly. Yeah, grandma showed you love through food, usually sweets. Mum does the same thing. Saying no to the food feels like saying no to the love. Yeah, and they react the same way as if you're rejecting them. Yes, you see how this relationship, this association, this meaning can be reinforced, not just by you, by those around you as well. And, if your identity feels, for example, unable to love itself, if you can't just feel love, but the mind remembers, oh, I've felt love before when I was eating cake with granddad or pasta with whoever, whatever it is, then it can come to the conclusion that you can't access that feeling without the cake, pasta, food, whatever. There was a definition created. That food equals love. Yes, eating the hot, sticky cinnamon rolls is anchored to the feeling of safety, home, security, unconditional love for you. Yes. Yeah. And see how in that structure you'll turn to that food to replenish that feeling of love or whatever it is, which perhaps you don't feel able to give to yourself in some cases. Or maybe you can feel love in other ways, but there's no other way to access that combination of love, significance, feeling special, or for you, the safety, security, home, unconditional love, right? Unique experience. Maybe it's the only time you feel able to be in that particular emotional state now that you're an adult. And maybe you're not, baking with granddad. And, especially if you combine that desire or addiction with a conflicting desire, but I want to be thin, so I can't allow myself cake. These things can turn into binge eating because it's not allowed. So you restrict yourself using willpower to suppress your desires, literally having to input conscious energy into the structure to oppose the natural flow. Right? In that structure, the output would be eat the cake or have the pasta. You start pushing against that, saying, no, I can't allow this output. So it's kind of like holding your hands over the end of a pipe to stop the flow of water, right? But how long can you hold it? And when you're exhausted from holding back the water and you can't do it anymore and you slip, well, there's a backlog of water and suddenly you're inundated, right? Is that metaphor landing with anyone else? Anyone else ever felt that way? Like you find yourself suddenly eating a whole cake or a whole pack of biscuits or a tub of peanut butter, whatever it is. And, it can also get entangled with all sorts of other beliefs, like this is our only chance, right? This food is not normally allowed. So if we're having some, we better get as much in as we can because we're going to have to go back to not having any because it's not allowed, right? See how that's a desire to binge. There's the conflicting tension structures end up creating the tendency to binge. Yeah. Feeling of screw it, not worth pushing against it any longer. Yeah, because you're tired of it, and you've been suppressing that part of you, so it's gonna fight back. I've had clients where binging is actually triggered years later. So like ice cream and other treats had been a harmless desire even into their adulthood, but then their mother died, and their mind went back to, in all that grief, their mind went back to my mom was the most significant person in my life, the one who truly cared for me. And she died. And now the only way I believe I get to feel her love is by eating ice cream, right? It had an association of that with, bonding with mother, right? It's that kind of, I feel lost without her. I don't know how to cope without her. She's gone now. I miss her. Eating all these things is the only way I get to feel close to her. That's what her mind was sort of saying. This was the dialogue, right? They were trying to keep accessing the feeling of being with their mother who was no longer physically present on earth, right? They were trying to access that feeling, that presence through ice cream, through a vehicle. Can you see that? I can tell you a story of a client who had some really unusual requirements and desires when it came to sex. right? Off the topic of food, this appears in all sorts of ways, right? With all sorts of things. This particular man needed women to wear lots of jewelry and needed like jingling sounds and all sorts of things like that, which was causing some real difficulties in his relationship as it happens, right? And also in his ability to just have sex and enjoy it in the way he wanted to. So it was getting in the way of his choice in life, right? It's not that there was anything inherently wrong with it. It was just, it was now getting in the way of his choice of life. That means, in the definition I've given you, it's harmful, right? And in hypnosis, he went back to memories of childhood where he'd never get to see his mum, right? She was a businesswoman, very busy, working all day, just never gave him any time, except right in the evening, last thing at night, she'd actually come into his room to see him. And he'd already be asleep by the time she got back, but he'd be woken up by the sound of her bracelets that she always wore as she walked down the corridor towards his room to come and see him. So he'd wake up with that sound and get really excited, right? This was his chance to see his mother, the most significant female figure in his life. And his mind ended up associating that sound with the feeling of all sorts of things: excitement, being seen, being given attention, and a tiny, love that he was so starved of. And later in life, he desired to feel that way around women, but his mind had coded it up that those emotions only became available to him when he'd hear those noises. And yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? Right? Needed the like metal clinking and all sorts of things. So you can see how an innocent child can make an innocent association with the subconscious mind, and they learn to desire something because of what that thing now means in their mental structures, the way that they're viewing and perceiving life, right? Remember, our actions are driven by emotions. So when we got to access a pleasurable state of being regularly as a child through one repeated experience, not only does our mind code up that, okay, this experience equals this feeling, we also want more of that feeling because we've experienced it repeatedly before. So it's defined as safe to the subconscious mind. On top of that, it's been defined as pleasure. So even more reason for the brain to try and move you towards it. And we can carry that over into adulthood, and it can turn into a really difficult desire to deal with. Yes, exactly, Dixie. Yeah, it wasn't sexual at all. It wasn't actually to do with sex. It was just a choice to have the feeling of love and attention from, any sexual partner, and being dependent on that code. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And, any desires based on experiencing pleasure can snowball, because every time you use or do the thing, you can reinforce it with your positive response, right? You can create a positive feedback loop. Okay, the subconscious mind always wants to move away from pain and towards pleasure. So it will naturally want to go back to something defined as pleasurable. And this may be anything. It may be an experience created by a drug, exercise, getting praise, worship, food, anything. It also loves what is familiar. Familiar means safe, right? So again, it will want to keep your behaviors consistent, meaning it wants to desire the same things you've always known and desired. And the more you choose or encounter that thing, the more familiar it becomes, and the more the subconscious wants to hold on to it. It strengthens that structure. But on top of that, once you develop a self-conscious mind by age 7, then when it feels good, the self-conscious can add positive meaning on top of it, right? On top of any subconscious meaning. And the perceived pleasure can be reinforced and amplified. And then if you're feeling pain and you feel powerless to escape it, for example, well, going back to that thing is a known path to pleasure, a very well-trodden path, right? It can create a bridge from pain to pleasure. Your mind knows that, okay? See that? And if you're not feeling much pleasure elsewhere in life, the mind can fixate on that one way or the few ways you've found that take you into a good feeling, right? And then things we used to enjoy harmlessly can become things that we enjoy that we wish we didn't, right? Because now we're obsessed. Now it's really difficult to say no. Now it's taking us out of choice. And most of us, if not all of us, experience what we call learned helplessness as a young child. Okay, we learn that we basically have no power to change things. So because a child, there will be many events when a child wants to do something, help someone or change, make something better, and it can't, because it's just a child. So we look to because of that, we look to external things to create change, including changing our inner state. And it's that sense of powerlessness. I'm not powerful enough or not able to choose to change my inner state that drives us to look for other things to facilitate that shift. Yeah, or it's a limitation of joy because we only allow it when. Yeah, there's a rule. I'm only allowed to feel this when. Yeah. And another thing I want to touch on just briefly is just, acknowledging how difficult it is when you are addicted to something or dependent on something in that way that is just everywhere, right? And that a lot of people have a normal relationship with. For example, the food or the sex, whatever it is, right? It makes you feel different. And everyone else seems to be having a fine time. And you're here struggling. And you notice it all the time because you're always around it. It really makes you feel different. You start to ask that question, what's wrong with me, right? We make it personal. It must be me. We feel even more separation from our desired end result. And our mind reinforces that identity, right? I'm a person who struggles with cravings or is obsessed with food, or I don't know, who's lazy and watches TV every day, or who can't cope without this thing, right? So before I get into a process, I do want to take you through just a little exercise. Firstly, I want you to ask yourselves if there is something in your life that you have a limiting relationship with, to the, where it's actually getting in the way of you creating your end results, right? Limiting and harmful. Or just limiting if you want to let go of that too. And I know we've focused on a subset of addictions today, but it doesn't matter if it falls under that category or not, right? For this exercise, we're bringing things into our awareness. So just anything that's limiting your creations, right? Are there any desires, tendencies, patterns, thoughts, anything that are limiting your creations? Yeah. Right. Really interesting. Dignity. I find myself very afraid to be undignified. Interesting. Right. So how have you, defined that? What does that mean? So once you've noticed if there are any desires or patterns like we've spoken about that are getting in the way of your choices. Yes, right. Gets in the way of crazy play or dance or expression in public. Right. Yes. Yes. Limiting the ways you're allowed to express yourself or show up. Yeah. Codependency. Right. Yeah. So once you've noticed some of those things, yeah. So whatever your answer was to that first question, whatever those things are, take that thing or those things and ask yourself, how have you defined that thing? Right? Maybe it's your partner if it's codependency. Maybe it's, for example, what does chocolate mean to you, right? What definition and meaning have you given it, right? Maybe it's not even a specific food. Maybe it's the act of eating itself, right? What does eating mean to you? Maybe you define it as safe, comforting, the only way I get my needs met. For a lot of babies, when they're breastfed, that is the time where suddenly all their needs are met. Suddenly I'm connected to my mother. I'm in her arms. I feel safe. I'm fed. I'm comforted. I feel love, all the things. And see how that's associated with feeding, right? Yeah. Maybe it's compulsive exercise. In that case, what does physical exertion mean to you? Maybe it's TV. Do you feel like you have to watch something every day, or you just spend too many hours watching TV to avoid doing other things, right? If so, go into the meaning. How has your mind defined the act of watching TV? Maybe it means escape into fantasy where everything works out, nothing really matters, anything's possible, right? That hope, that escape, that freedom. Maybe it means, I get to live in someone else's world and not be me for a while, which could equally apply to books. So just ask yourself, notice. Yeah, for you, unhealthy food choices affects your choice to live healthy, vital body, healthy life and body. Yeah. 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 So all the above: OCD, exercise, playing Sudoku, cleaning, fasting for 5 days. Yep. Yep. So a lot of obsessive or addictive structures at play. Yeah. So with all that acknowledged and uncovered, who wants to reset your desires to align with your new self, to the version of you that's living in an end result you love? Anyone want to do that? Yeah, awesome. So